is the tour of the Piedras, Mercadas, Pueblo that I took this last Thursday, and what an exciting surprise for me to get to go to this site, and I'll show you kind of where it's located in relation to where I live, and some history around that. And before I begin, um, I'll mention a couple of other historic sites that I've been to over the last couple of years. First being Chaco Canyon, which is about 4 hours from where I live, maybe 3.5. The last hour is on a very rough dirt road, so it's not that far off the highway, but it is in time, not distance. But Chaco was a very significant cultural center. People made pilgrimages from all over the region to go to this site. It was a very religious and spiritual place. There were about 650 rooms in Casa Bonita, which you're seeing in the lower right-hand corner. Those round things are kivas, which would have been a place for, spiritual practice and retreat. But people would come and stay here. They would bring grain, they would bring food that would be shared. So there were some permanent residents at Chaco, but I think it was a lot of people coming and going. And in the upper photo here, you see a huge, huge kiva that's on the opposite side of the canyon from Casa Bonita. And you also see these set of doorways that are in Casa Bonita. Note the stone architecture. This building was made of stone, or all of the buildings in this area were made of stone, so they remain really intact. But there was a lot of cultural influence coming out of Chaco into the surrounding areas. And last September, I had the opportunity to go to the Mimbres Valley, which is south west of where I live, probably, again, about 4 hours, near Silver City. The Mimbres people originally were known for their pit homes or pit houses, and they would dig a circular pit down about 4 feet and then build a roof above it, and that's how they lived in the Mimbres Valley. But as they began to mix with the Chaco culture, there was very much a significant influence on their architecture, and so they began to build in block houses and block rooms. And you see this replica of one of the room blocks here. And I think what's notable is that there aren't any doors in these structures. There were holes in the ceiling, and so you would actually climb up a ladder onto the roof and then climb down into the main room of your dwelling. And in that main room, then, they would build a fire in the wintertime, and smoke would come out that opening, and the heat would also dissipate into adjacent rooms. So you'd have a central room and then other sleeping quarters within the room block. Perhaps a family might have 2 or 3 rooms to themselves. The Mimbres people were around at the same time as Chaco, around 1100 AD to about 1300, but then they closed up shop. And the reason was that the river where they got their water was eroding, and that riverbed was dropping. And it got to the point where it was too low to be able to irrigate their fields. It was well below the valley floor. And whereas in the past they could just dig channels for irrigation, they just couldn't raise the water up. And so when we went out there in September, the river is now about 30 feet below, as it's really below the valley floor, as it's really cut down through. Also mention the Taos Pueblo, which is the oldest continuously habited Pueblo in the United States. You do see doors on this modern structure, which would have been European influence. This was built about the same time, about between 1100 and 1300. I think this might have been started around 1300. Then about 1350, 1400, it was moved a little bit to the west, no one knows why, and you see multi-story structures here, but people are still living here. You do not see internal stairways. You see people going in and out of their higher stories through the rooftops of the other parts of the building. House Pueblo is built of mud brick and mortar, and all of the Pueblos had like a gravel foundation. Some were built of mud brick, and then the ones in the Albuquerque area were not so much bricked up, but they were mud that was filled up in forms, and the mud and the wall was built right in place. So you see in this upper right where they would have had some kind of a form and then filled it up with mud with various layers, tamped it down, and then that is what formed the wall. In all cases, there were timbers that were brought in, large timbers that would have supported the roof, with smaller timbers and cane and logs that would have been the cross members as well for the roof support. I'll mention that aside from the Native American traditions, there are Spanish traditions that are widely different in this state. It's something that I've been learning over the last 6 months or so, that in the north region of New Mexico, can you see my pointer? There we go. Up in the northern region, up near Red River, north of Taos, Santa Fe, there are very traditional Spanish customs, particularly around the holidays. And so they are practicing medieval Spanish customs that were influenced by the Moors and the Byzantines, very, very traditional. And as you go south in the state, it's become more Americanized. So I'm talking about bonfires around the Christmas holiday and how they lit lanterns and how they would go from house to house to visit as Mary and Jesus did. And so just different traditions that I think are regional, and it's helpful to know that. In the backstory of, I'm going to talk about visiting this Pueblo site. I will mention that when I moved here, I was looking at Placitas as a place to live. It's about 15 miles northwest of Albuquerque, typically 1-acre lots. It's higher up, it's very desert-like, but not a lot of crime. Nice community, but kind of very rustic and out there. And some friends of mine said, Drew, you should check out the North Valley. You can have sort of a rural bubble and still be right in Albuquerque. And as I was flying over the Rio Grande, flying out of Albuquerque, I would notice this this belt of green trees and very lush foliage and so forth. So when I moved here, though, I just bought a house. I bought this house because I thought it was beautiful. I had no idea of the area and where I lived. And it was only after I moved in that I discovered that there's this acequia, or the irrigation ditch, and even more recently discovering that this ditch is over 250 years old. This is a tree, a cottonwood tree that's growing along the ditch. You can see the age, obviously, of this tree. And there's also a working farm around the corner. Now, if you look in the distance between the farmhouse and the trees, you'll see kind of this little hilltop. That's a volcano out on the west end of Albuquerque. This is still a working farm. It's farmed by Herman Pedroncelli. He's 79 years old and still working this land. His father owned this land and was struck by lightning in the early 1940s when Herman was just 2 or 3 years old, and there were 6 children, and so his mother had to go work on a nearby farm and became the farm nanny for some other children. She was known to be a good cook, and she saved her money and then built this house on the property in the early 50s. But this is a working farm, and it's exciting to have that nearby. And Herman raises cattle. He grows alfalfa and hay, and he helps rehabilitate cattle that are sick or injured. It's sort of fun to have cows in the community. Albuquerque used to flood on a regular basis, and there were levees that were built in the 1800s or so, but then the Cochiti Dam was built about halfway between Albuquerque and Santa Fe. So this is, about 30 miles northwest of Albuquerque, and so the Rio Grande was dammed off, and so we've got some flood control. But otherwise, the floodwaters used to come up pretty high around here. I live in the North Valley, and this area was settled by the Spanish around 1710 to 1750. The South Valley is older. This was settled in the 1600s. So in between is downtown Albuquerque, and while that's new, there's an old town which was sort of a fortress where people lived and could live safely in the 16 and 1700s. So let's go to the next stage of the backstory. As you may recognize this picture, I did some campaign work for Mayor Keller. This is Mayor Tim Keller and his wife Liz with my dog Connor, and we put on a free breakfast event at a local park. This is my neighbor Sharon and my other neighbors Frank and Martha Spring, and some of my other friends and colleagues. And as we put that on, one of the members of our event committee was Enrique Lamadrid. And Enrique was the chair of the Spanish department at the University of New Mexico. And he's not only a language expert, he is highly published in the area of cultural heritage from a Spanish perspective and Native American perspective in the state of New Mexico. He helped translate these children's books and presented them to Mayor Keller's children. And why I bring these pictures up is because Enrique at the time was very upset that there was construction going on some of the old Pueblo sites. He said if we were on the East Coast, these are even some battlegrounds. There are ancient peoples, there's shards of pottery everywhere, and they are bulldozing those sites and putting houses on them. If we were on the East Coast, they would be protected. And so he's always talked about, taking us to these different sites, and finally we said, let's have a field trip. And there were a couple of sites he wanted to take us. So this last week, we were going to go up to Bernalillo, which is about 15 miles north, but they didn't open until late. We couldn't fit into our schedule. So we went to a place that's closer by. Now, this is where I live. This is my house off of Griegos Road, which was the Griego farm, and Griegos meaning Greeks. We went to a site, I'll show you the directions, that is near the Albuquerque Nature Center. That site is 6 miles from my house. I had no idea what to expect or what was going to be there. And this is just a kind of, the Nature Center is to the south here, and you can walk down to the Rio Grande. But this site is protected, was originally private property, and was the location of an old Pueblo back around, somewhere between 11 and 1300. It was developed, and then people were living there until the 1500s. We were met there by an anthropologist, Matt Schmader, who was formerly the anthropologist for the city of Albuquerque. So he was responsible for all the archaeologic work across the city at various sites and historic places. He had the key to let us in because this spot is closed to the public. It is fenced. I asked, who built that fence? And he said, actually, it was probably been there since the 1950s, and in the 1980s, this property was acquired or purchased by the city of Albuquerque, and it is closed off to the public because it's very sensitive. Meeting us was, here you see Enrique and his wife Carlota, and then my friend Pam, who is a ethnobotanist. And Pam worked for the state. She did a lot of work, not only looking at what ancient peoples were eating at the places where they lived, she was also a specialist in what fuels they were using to cook their food, what type of wood or other materials were used for cooking. So we're walking around this site. There's not much there to see, except I could begin to see rocks. I see volcanic rock, and then also shards of pottery. And the pottery was beautiful, sitting above the ground. But a lot of interesting artifacts, obviously, camals and mortar and pestle type things. There were 12 pueblos in the region called Tiwa. Some people call it Tiwesh. And what you see here are 11 of those pueblos in the Rio Grande Valley. I live about right here near the Rio Grande River. And so you see 11 of the pueblos to the south would have been what the Spanish called the Isleta, or island. It was sort of a peninsula at the bend of a river. So another major pueblo that's not in this particular picture, but we were visiting Piedras, Mercados. Up to the north is Cuana and Santiago, and those are open to the public and they have been excavated, but some of these other sites have not. And Sandy is the one that's getting construction built on it, and Calabasitas, and some of these others north of Alameda are the ones that Enrique is speaking of and concerned with their preservation. Some of the larger pueblos had about 1,000 rooms. They housed between 1,500 and 2,000 people. So they really had quite a society that had developed over time in the valley. And they were growing corn and beans and squash for food. They were also growing cotton and were known to have been weaving very fine fabric with their cotton. And then they were wearing adornments of turquoise and bone and feathers and so forth. So very fine clothing. They were eating bison and turkey that were in the area. This is turkey remains that were part of the Pueblo that we visited. They never excavated it, but they did do some surface digging, and so they found these remains and then covered them back up. There was also organized religion, and the Petroglyph National Park is just to the west of this particular pueblo, and so you see religious influences that probably came from Chaco Canyon and dispersed throughout the state, but there are pretty significant hieroglyphs in the area. I'll also mention that the bosque, which is now what we call the river forest, beautiful green belt of trees that line the Rio Grande. This area was completely deforested at that time. There wasn't a stick, and so Matt kind of had a quote, "There's not a matchstick to be found in the 16th century along the Rio Grande," because all of this was either used for fuel or construction. Anything that would sprout up would get used. So the Native Americans were going into, the Tiwa tribe were going into the mountains and foothills to get their timber and lumber at that time. Any questions so far if you want to come off mute? Well, later comes the Coronado expedition, and you've probably heard of Ponce de Leon. He came up through the east into Florida, and then Coronado came up through the west. And Coronado was a governor in the western region of Mexico, and they had heard of the seven golden cities of Cibola. And so they were amassing funds and resources for this expedition to go find these cities of gold so that they could plunder them. And so not only was he given some funding from the Viceroy of Mexico, or New Spain, as it was called at the time, he also took a loan or pawned some of his wife's property because she came from a very wealthy family, and they began their trip around 1539. Now, they got to Cibola, did not find the Golden City, but they wanted to keep going. And so a scout had gone into the Tiwa region, which is, the valley where I live now, and said, come on up. And so Coronado brought his teams up into the valley, and they arrived in December of 1540. I see different numbers of people in different things that I read. So figure about 30 Spanish soldiers, 300 Spanish soldiers, 300 servants of theirs, and then they had enslaved a number of people from the native region of New Spain, and many of them were warriors. So they brought up somewhere between 1,200 to 2,000 warriors with them to protect them. And they brought their horses, cattle, goats, and sheep. Now, if you think about walking this distance, you're usually, lucky to cover 10 miles a day on foot, maybe a little more on horse. But in this case, they're on undeveloped trails, and they're also bringing horses, cattle, goats with them. They've got to stop and scout out, what's going to be their camp for the night and so forth. So it took some number of months to travel from New Spain into what is kind of on the border of Arizona and New Mexico, and then into the Tiwa region. They were told by a Native American who they named El Turk that there was this magical city called Quivira up in the Kansas area, and that even the poorest people were very wealthy and prosperous in this region because there was so much gold. So they sent 30 men up on an extended trip. Excuse me. And they found just another Native American little village. And so when they got back, I think they strangled them to death. But that was the extent of their trip. And they did, though, spend the winter in 1540 when they arrived in the Tiwa area. Another map of their travels. So up in Kuana was probably one of the larger pueblos. They gave them some gifts and said, could we make camp next to your pueblo? And so they put up straw huts, only it was a particularly cold winter. And so the Spanish decided that they were going to run the Pueblans out. They sent them out of that Pueblo into the night with their clothes only, and they took their food stores and their fuel. They had corn stalks and corn husks, and that the Puebloans would be using for heat fuel, and so the Spanish were feeding that to their pigs along with their stores of grain that they had stored up for the winter. So they pushed them out. Those people went to some other neighboring pueblos. A Spanish soldier assaulted the wife of a Tiwa man, and I think that kind of did it and sent them over the edge. So they decided to revolt. And in the middle of the night, the Pueblans killed 60 Spanish horses and mules, and then Coronado declared war. There was a small skirmish where pretty much everybody um, on the Tiwa side were killed, but the Puebloans beforehand did manage to burn 30 of the soldiers alive at the stake. So Coronado said, we will have a battle, and this will be at a site called Moho. And a lot of this has been recorded over throughout the expedition and archived. So we do have writing of what occurred during this conflict, but nobody knew quite where it occurred. They just didn't know that there were Spanish cavalry and that the native warriors coming up from Mexico were fighting alongside them. They had more sophisticated weapons, and this was a drawing that was, I think, redone in the 1800s at some point, but from a drawing from 1541. We see what the European people had as weapons. They had crossbows, and they also had a musket, very primitive, that would shoot balls of lead and iron. They did wrap their arrows with copper tips that were quite sharp, and they were also firing iron nails. Their shields were made of leather, and looking at some of the excavation of where they were, they could tell that they had metal strips that were sewn into their clothing, so there were some sort of primitive form of armor around them. The Mexican warriors mostly had slings, and that was their weapon of choice. They were very good at it, and so they have found a lot of sling stones. They were smaller stones, but they really could cause a great deal of injury. And then the Mexican warriors also had obsidian arrows as well. The native Tiwa didn't have any kind of weaponry. They didn't have the sling technology yet. So they had a limited number of arrows that they used for hunting, and the only other weapon they had were rocks that they could hurl and hurt you with those rocks. So there's debate about where did this conflict occur. Some people, as they had taken over Cuana, think that the conflict might have happened at the Santiago Pueblo just to the south, and then other people think that it could have been Piedras, Mercadas. And what we'll see is, what we're now seeing at this site that we toured this past week. And here's our group with Matt speaking with Pam and Carlota and Enrique in this field that has been fenced off. This site was never excavated at the request of the Native American community, but it has been surveyed and marked. So there's markers all over the place. There were some digs that were very superficial, but basically they really wanted to leave it as undisturbed as possible. Early on, when they purchased the property, the city purchased the property in the 1980s, Matt did some surveying with his medical detector, and here's what he found. In the ruins of this site, the red dots are iron, and the green dots are lead and copper. So you can see that there was a pretty significant battle here where the Spanish were using both musket balls and copper-tipped arrows. So significant amount of metal in the ground. That proved that this was the site of this Moho conflict. They were doing a resistivity surveying to determine what was underground and find the structures that were there. They noted that the kivas were square in this pueblo, not round. There were passageways that were barricaded, a couple of them, but you see this big open area initially through the first surveys, and then they developed some models, and they were able to determine that this was a multi-story building, at least 2 stories throughout. Some areas were as high as 4 stories high. So interesting, and they had the roof structure to be able to support those upper stories. So you see this big gap here that would be kind of penetrable, but in later surveys and perhaps with LiDAR and other technology, they were able to detect that there was more structure that so that this was completely, surrounded by wall. One of my initial questions for Matt was, we're on the floodplain of the Rio Grande. And so did this area flood much? And he said it was, the Pueblo was located here because they really didn't have a lot of disruption due to flooding. So they really thought through this location. He said down closer to the river, and so at the lower elevation, they see a lot of erosion, and they see a lot of deposits at the higher elevation. But at this particular site, he said the water level might have come up, a foot or two, but would not have been rough enough to really disturb the area. So it's nicely intact. They do know from the weapons that they have found on the ground and in the soil how the conflict began. And so the Spanish are in the red, behind the blue lines here, which are the Mexican warriors with their slings, and they were starting to pelt the green line, which would have been the Tiwa people who were defending from the south. As the conflict grew, the Tiwa retreated and they went up onto their roofs. And the Spanish decided to just leave him and, try to just starve him out. And it was really more about water scarcity, I think, than anything. And then they went in and, as people were trying to escape, they really let them have it. So you see not just leftover weaponry, stones, rocks, and the metal objects around the periphery, but then you begin to see them inside of the Pueblo itself. And what Matt was saying was that every man, woman, and child inside that structure went onto the roof, and they were breaking apart some of their objects and cooking utensils and so forth that were made of rock. They had forged every single rock that they could find in the area, and they were pelting people. And so what they found in the area is some armor in the ground that would have come out of the clothing of Spanish people, of the soldiers who had perished and were kind of left there to rot. They found a number of crossbow bolt heads, and these were made of copper. There were also a number of nails that were found on the site, and these were not used for construction. These were used for pelting the Tiwa. These are not original artifacts, but Matt showed us some reproductions of both the nail and the copper-tipped tool that would have been put on an arrow and used as a weapon. Obsidian that came from the site, and sling stones found throughout the site. So they show some sling stone distribution where they have found them through their surface. Either they're sitting on the surface or they're just below. Some of the they had called them sling bombs, and so they were the larger stones that were hurled. But you can kind of see where the Mexican soldiers were coming in and hitting people in the interior and exterior of the structure. Musket balls have been found. They're ranging, they're around about a half caliber from the 16th century, Spanish musket. Really impressive. He also showed us this drawing of artifacts that were found. So when they did, the Tiwa people did throw their rocks and they hit a Spanish soldier, they then just pelted them to death. And they were probably, their clothing was coming apart. They were pelted so bad. So there are pieces of clothing and other artifacts that were found. The bell, buckles, clothing fasteners, a horse bridle cinch. Pretty interesting stuff that they have found in there. And you can see the location of where those objects were found. So obviously, these soldiers were killed kind of on the, I think this is probably the east side of the structure. And then you can see the throwing stones that have been mapped, where every single person in the Pueblo went up onto the roof and they were just hurling rocks. It's the only weaponry they had, and they were pretty effective. But you can really see how much these are concentrated around the periphery before the Spanish and Mexican soldiers were able to penetrate into the structure. And what was so fascinating is you can just see the lines of rocks on the surface, still there where they were thrown 500 years ago. Pretty impressive. And you're seeing volcanic stone that would have come from, volcanic areas just to the west, as well as river stone and granite, all kinds of different rock that are laying on the ground. So each of these were probably, somebody got killed with some of these. As a result of our little tour, Pam has been there before. I had not, and Carlota had never been onto the site. But Matt is going to give Pam some ash that they have found on the site, and she's going to do some pro bono analysis to determine, what type of fuel was used in their cooking. And then Enrique is working on signage that's going into the other Pueblo sites. Some of them are, as I mentioned, are getting bulldozed, and there's developments going in, but he wanted to at least let the public know that this used to be the ruins of an important archaeologic site. And then we're going to go up to the Santiago site in a couple of weeks. So if you want to come off mute, I'll take any questions.
The nails is, okay, those square, the big-headed nails, were those shot from the guns, or what was their use? Were they throwing them in slings?
I think they were shot from the guns because they were from the Spanish. I think they were gunshot. And I don't, that's an interesting question in that, did they use those as their second rounds after their lead shot was used up, and then they resorted to nails, or were they using them both? I don't know. I'll ask.
So was this work ever published, or?
Yes. Yes, and I can send you the paper.
Because I would think that that would be something that ought to be in, National Geographic or a number of other publications, because it's really, um, this is important Coronado history.
Significant history. 6 miles from my house, and they only do about 12 tours of this site per year. As you saw it, it's behind a locked fence and locked gate. And so for us to get together with Matt, who's a friend of Enrique, and Pam as well, was incredible. I think what an honor to get to go in here and be with this group for a couple of hours. So I can't wait to see the other sites to the north, which they have excavated. And the reason they have not excavated Piedras Mercadas is because the Native American community requested that because there are dead people, buried under there, that it just be left alone.
So at the conclusion of the battle, did they just raise the Pueblo or?
I don't think so. I think it stood for a while, and most of the Tiwa people fled into the mountains when after this conflict, and so after Coronado's party left the area, they did come back to inhabit it for a short time. Now, at the beginning of New Spain and Spanish occupation in the area now known as Mexico, Central America, North America, there were 25 million native people in the New Spain region. And after about 100 years, there were only 1 million because of both disease and epidemics for the communicable diseases that were brought in, but also the mistreatment of people as well. One thing I forgot to mention about Mimbres, remember the Mimbres Valley I spoke of at the beginning of the presentation, they would bury grandma inside the house. So they would dig a hole in the living room floor down a couple of feet, and grandma would get laid in there and covered up. And so usually women, sometimes children, were buried within the living structure or underneath it. And then men sometimes were buried also under the floor of the house, the dirt floor. And then, but men were often buried outside. But it was interesting to me that people were buried under the living room floor.
When did Coronado leave that area?
So he, let's see, he arrived in December of 1540. And then I want to say he departed around February. No, he departed later in spring. So I don't think that he stayed until maybe mid to late 1541. He went back and, he was in trouble. I think there was some investigation and possible, if you call it a court martial, because of some of his behavior up in the northern region and the atrocities that he did to native people. But he was not punished other than he had his governorship taken away. And I think he sat on the Mexico City Council, and he died about 10 years later. So he was only in the Tiwa region, let's see, from December. He was there maybe 9 months. And remember that party of 30 soldiers went up into Kansas and then came back, and then they all left. And he was sort of disgraced because his expedition was really a failure. He never found gold. Certainly they were wanting to be in the region because of spices. He didn't really find that either. So next slide show, I'll show Alcanfor Pueblo, which is Santiago, and that has been excavated in Kuana as well.
So when did the Spanish come back into that area then?
I don't think, I think that they were continuing to migrate in, but in Albuquerque, this area did not get settled until about 1650. I remember I showed you the South Valley. This is the North Valley. My area did not get settled until the early 1700s. So,
like Santa Fe and that region, the Spanish came back in there and then they were driven out.
I think there continued to be conflict, and it wasn't necessarily safe. So, as I was saying, like Old Town was probably settled pretty early, like early 1600s, but I don't think that they expanded out until later, until it was safe. And some of that had to do with resolving some of the conflict that continued, that they then, found some peace. There were some peace treaties, and the conflict, I think, began to resolve. This,
Is the church still there?
yes, yes, and so this is my house. My house is the blue dot over here. I know across Guadalupe Trail on the other side. Get my pen again. In this area on this side, this is the irrigation ditch that's near my house, about a half block away. They were growing tobacco on the other side of the ditch, and I think on my side they were maybe growing some tobacco, but they were growing alfalfa mainly. And so this was all farmland. There are, of course, farm homes, and this is an architectural preservation site as well. So the original Guadalupe Church is now a private home. It sits on the corner, just around the corner from me, and then they rebuilt the church, a more modern church, later. And I've been researching where was the plaza for the Griegos area. There were different farms, and each of them would have had a number of family members who were working the land, and then they did have like plazas where they could trade. And the plaza is just around the corner from me. I just found that out this week.
Now, who brought the tobacco there? The Spaniards?
Yes. Well, of course they were Greeks. The Griegos were, Greek family, but.
Yeah, okay.
And this is a photograph of the plaza that was around the corner from me. So you can see a little part of the church that's there, and that the wagons are lined up, and they're probably doing some trade, surrounded by some buildings. This land was given to Juan Griego in 1708, and this photograph was taken in 1883. What I'll show you in the next slide is the acequia that is near my house. So here, I'm in the red dot over here, and the acequia is flowing from the Rio Grande, and then it's flowing south. My neighbors pay about $7 a year for water rights. A lot of people in my neighborhood used to have water rights. There used to be fingers off the acequia into the fields near my house. Those are since covered up. You can see where they were. But my area was all irrigated by this acequia. So I'm now estimating it was dug sometime between 1708 and 1780, and probably in different phases. But as they were farming in this area, that's when it would have been put in. This line here that's marked in red from this map that I found is a drain. So the water would flow from the river, it would flow south, and then it would flow back to the river. They only lose about 7% of the acequia water to evaporation. It also is draining in and helping to feed the aquifer, but as you saw with the farm around the corner, they are still flooding their fields. Amazing that it's been around so long. I can't remember the date of this map, but you can see the acequia is already in place, and I want to say this was late 1700s. That's it.